right, we have these options. It's in our best interest to believe, right, rather than not. Because if we don't believe in God and we're atheists and God turns out to exist, then, right, it's bad news for us in the afterlife. So what are the objections to Pascal's wager, or at least some typical ones? Well, Pascal assumes that one will be rewarded in the afterlife if they are a theist. But then the question becomes, is belief alone sufficient for eternal paradise? What if one believes in the wrong God or gods? So then it becomes a question of motivation for God, right? Pascal assumes that there's little to no benefit to having faith if it turns out your faith is misplaced. One could argue that there are still benefits to this, right? So Pascal assumes that one is condemned to eternal punishment if they are an atheist. Not only may this turn out to be an incorrect view of divine justice, it negates any possibility of atheism benefiting you during this life, which a lot of people criticize. And Pascal assumes again that there's no possibility of atheism benefiting you during your life, but it may be the case for those who view religious belief as potentially harmful, right? Another objection that comes up, if I can go back a slide, is, we'd have to consider cases where someone maybe lives a really bad life, right? But they always believe in God, right? So they do bad things and they believe in God just to get into heaven. And maybe they believe in God for reasons that they haven't really thought deeply about, but they still believe when they die. It seems weird for God to reward that person, but punish the person who lives a very, very good life and helps other people, but just happens to not have the right theological commitments. That seems very bizarre and counterintuitive to a lot of people. So if you imagine somebody who maybe they are not a believer in the standard Christian story of Jesus and the resurrection and all that, but maybe they have a slightly adjacent belief, but they've lived a very, very good life, then it seems like God is in the business of punishing the person for perhaps even being for not believing in the right theological commitments, while rewarding the bad life, but they have the right epistemological commitments. So I hope that makes sense. So a lot of people think this seems to incentivize people just believing that God exists without really having to have the right commitments. So that seems to be a problem for a lot of people. So that kind of ties into some of the things I was talking about here. So let's leave that aside. There's much more we could say about Pascal's wager, but we'll move on to religious experience, because this is I think perhaps an even more standard argument for God that doesn't rely on the things like the cosmological and teleological arguments, because many philosophers and many people of religious persuasion think personal religious experience is the best argument for God. So we've already talked about pragmatism a little bit in our epistemology section. And so remember that pragmatism is the belief or the view that truth is what works at its most basic level. So pragmatism is typically thought of as not being evidentialists. So you have evidentialists like the philosopher Clifford, who argue that belief in God or belief in anything without sufficient evidence is not only irrational, but it's morally wrong. We should never believe in anything without sufficient evidence. So William James takes a different approach. He's an American philosopher and psychologist, along with his brother, one of the most influential philosophers in US history, certainly had a big influence during his life. And he's been an authority on philosophical pragmatism and psychological functionalism. He wrote a lot on other things as well, not just religion, but certainly his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, has been very influential, where he gives this argument about belief in God without evidence. So according to James, sometimes we may be personally justified in making what he calls a leap of faith to embrace a belief that is entirely unsupported by evidence. Only if other possibilities are ruled out, and this does not justify someone else's belief. It's not meant to be evidence of God's existence, but we are personally justified in making that leap when we don't have any other available evidence, or in James's case, when the other arguments for God's existence don't compel us. We have personal motivations to believe in God without evidence, right? This is why we call it a leap of faith. Since the other arguments aren't going to establish anything, according to James and others, we have to take belief in God as a leap of faith without requiring evidence, just like we would take a leap of faith and trust somebody, right? So one of the standard analogies that people make with James's argument is trust. Okay, so if we're thinking of, say, a romantic partner, okay, we don't demand evidence every day that they've been faithful if we're in a monogamous relationship. We put trust and faith in them, right? We don't demand evidence like, prove to me that you've been faithful to me today, right? That's not what we do, or at least not most of us. So what do? We take a leap of faith that, in the absence of some kind of evidence, that we trust the person, right? We make a leap of faith to embrace the belief that they've been faithful.